ever heard that we only use 10% of our brains? We have all this hidden potential just waiting to be unlocked.
Yeah.
It's a pretty intriguing idea.
It is.
Today, we are going to deep dive into this whole 10% brain myth
Yeah.
and see if there's any truth to it at all.
Okay.
You sent over some really interesting articles from MIT's McGovern Institute,
Right.
Medical News Today,
Yeah.
and the Association for Psychological Science. So
Yeah.
let's jump in.
Let's debunk some myths.
Well, let's get right to it. Is the 10% brain myth actually a myth?
Well, yeah, the 10% brain myth is exactly that, a myth.
Okay, so no telekinesis,
Yeah.
no hidden genius, just
Yeah.
waiting to be unlocked.
Afraid not.
Okay.
The MIT and the Medical News Today articles both reference brain imaging studies
Right.
that show that even simple tasks activate various parts of the brain. It's not like there's this big chunk of our brain just sitting there idle.
So how do we know that? Like, what kind of imaging are we talking about here?
So one of the most common techniques is fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging,
Okay.
and it measures brain activity by detecting changes in blood flow.
Okay.
So when a certain area of the brain is working harder, it needs more blood, and fMRI can pick that up.
Okay.
These studies show activity across the brain, even for like really basic tasks.
That makes sense. But if we're using all of our brains, then why does this myth persist?
Right.
I mean, you mentioned that the Association for Psychological Science article
Yeah.
found that even some teachers believe it.
It is surprising how widespread this belief is.
Yeah.
You know, I think the article points out that these kinds of misconceptions, they're often rooted in a desire for self-improvement.
Right.
So, you know, the idea that we have this vast untapped potential is very appealing.
Like we're all hoping for that shortcut to becoming superhuman or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the reality is that our brains are already incredibly complex and active.
Right.
So it's not about accessing some unused portion. It's more about understanding how the entire organ functions and how we can best support that.
Well, on that note, you mentioned that the MIT article traced this whole 10% myth back to William James.
Yes.
What did he actually say about our mental resources?
So back in 1907, he suggested that we only tap into a small part of our mental potential. His ideas were more nuanced than the 10% myth suggests.
Right.
But it is really interesting to see how they may have contributed to this misconception over time.
It's like a game of telephone, where the message gets distorted as it's passed along.
Precisely. And this particular message got amplified, I think, when people started attributing the 10% idea to Albert Einstein,
Of course, yeah.
even though there's no evidence he ever said it.
The Einstein effect.
Yeah.
Anything with his name attached to it, suddenly it's credible.
Right.
But let's go back to what we do know about how our brains work.
Okay.
The MIT article also mentioned brain plasticity.
Yes.
What exactly is that?
So brain plasticity refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt throughout life.
Okay.
It's this remarkable capacity to rewire itself in response to new experiences, learning, and even injury.
So when we learn a new skill, it's not like we're suddenly using more of our brain,
Right.
but rather our brain is forming these new connections and pathways.
Exactly. And the fact that our brains are constantly changing and adapting, that's another strong argument against the 10% myth.
So we're not stuck with like a fixed amount of brain power.
No.
That's encouraging.
Absolutely. The brain is incredibly dynamic.
Yeah.
It's constantly learning, growing, and finding new ways to function effectively.
That brings up another point from the MIT article.
Yeah.
The sheer amount of energy our brains consume.
Yes.
They mentioned 20% of our body's calories. right?
Yes. Despite being only 2% of our body weight,
Wow.
our brains are energy hogs.
Yeah.
And this just underscores how active they are, even when we're not consciously engaged in a task.
So while we may not be telekinetic superheroes, our brains are doing some pretty incredible work behind the scenes.
They are.
It's a shame that this whole 10% myth distracts from that.
Yeah, it really is. It's like focusing on an empty parking lot when there's this bustling city just around the corner.
Yeah.
We need to shift our attention to the amazing things our brains are already doing
Right.
and how we can best support their incredible capabilities.
Speaking of amazing capabilities, the Medical News Today article dives into some other common brain myths,
Yeah.
like the idea that alcohol kills brain cells.
Oh, yes. That's another one we should unpack.
Yeah.
The reality is a bit more nuanced.
So you're telling me that a glass of wine with dinner
Right.
isn't actually erasing my brain cells?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
While excessive alcohol consumption
Okay.
can certainly damage the brain, Moderate drinking doesn't outright kill brain cells.
Great.
It can, however, disrupt communication between neurons
Okay.
and impair cognitive function, at least temporarily.
So it's not about cell death,
Right.
but more about hindering
Yeah,
our brain's ability to function at its best.
exactly.
Got it.
And this brings us to another important point.
Okay.
Our brains are incredibly interconnected.
Okay.
The Medical News Today article also touched on the myth of left brain versus right brain dominance.
Right.
This idea that logical people are left-brained and creative people are right-brained.
Yeah.
This is a gross oversimplification of how the brain works.
So it's not like we have these two separate brains
Right.
battling it out for control.
Not at all.
Okay.
While different brain regions specialize in certain functions,
Right.
they work together in complex ways.
Well,
There's constant communication between both hemispheres.
okay.
And this integrated activity is essential for everything we do.
It seems like a lot of these myths like to put our brains into these neat little boxes,
Yeah.
when in reality it's so much more fluid and dynamic.
I think that's a great observation. Our brains are constantly evolving,
Yeah.
adapting and finding new ways to process information.
Well, if we're debunking myths,
Okay.
let's talk about how we can actually boost our brain power.
Yes.
You mentioned both MIT and Medical News Today articles.
Yeah,
Offered some practical advice on this.
absolutely.
What do they say?
So the good news is that there are many things we can do
Okay.
to support brain health and enhance cognitive function.
Right.
The MIT article really emphasized the importance of sleep,
Okay.
exercise, a balanced diet, and stress management.
So no magic pill,
Right.
just a combination of healthy habits.
Exactly.
What about the Medical News Today article? Did they have any specific recommendations?
Yeah, they went a bit deeper into the dietary aspects,
Okay.
highlighting the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids,
Okay.
antioxidants, and certain vitamins.
Got it.
They also mentioned brain training exercises
Okay.
as a way to challenge our cognitive abilities.
So things like crossword puzzles,
Yeah.
Sudoku, those could actually be beneficial.
They certainly can.
Int-
Engaging in mentally stimulating activities, whether it's puzzles, learning a new language, or playing a musical instrument,
Right.
helps keep our brains sharp.
Like a workout for our minds.
Exactly.
But thinking back to that 10% myth,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, what other facts about ourselves
Right.
might we be taking for granted?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It really highlights the importance of critical thinking
Mm-hmm.
and being open to new discoveries, especially when it comes to something as complex as the human brain.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that learning is a continuous journey.
It is.
I can't just accept everything we hear at face value.
Right.
Well, on that note, I'd love to hear from our listeners.
Yes.
Have you ever fallen for any of these brain myths? What are some of your favorite brain-boosting activities?
Yeah.
Share your thoughts with us.
We are always eager to learn from our audience and
Yeah.
continue this exploration together.
So to wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
Simply put, we use all of our brains.
Right.
The 10% myth is a persistent misconception,
Right.
but the reality is far more fascinating.
Yeah.
Our brains are incredibly complex and active, constantly working to shape our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
And while we may not have telekinesis
Right.
or hidden genius lurking in some untapped region,
Yeah.
we can absolutely take steps to optimize our brain health and function.
Exactly.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So, as a final thought for our listeners to ponder,
Yeah.
if we so readily believed this 10% brain myth,
Right.
what other facts about ourselves might we be taking for granted?
It's a question worth considering
Yeah.
as we navigate the world and strive to understand ourselves and our full capabilities.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of the brain.
It was a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another exploration of the intriguing ideas that shape our understanding of the world around us.